I see Israeli in the news. I see Israel in the news. I see the country Israel in the news. There's going to be a falling off of a prime minister or a person in leadership government in Israel. Who can know the Spirit of the Lord except the Spirit himself? He said to tell you again that there's going to be a falling off of authority, Shobia Sandaya God, as it relates to the country Israel. Re Hobia Shandaya God. I lift you up, Jesus. God is saying that I share these things not for the glory of the people, but for the glory of God. Robia, because the Bible declared that the spirit of prophecy confirms that God is real. Who can know him? Who can understand him? Who can be like him? Who can be like Jesus? Robia Shambaya God. God just took me into the spirit. And in the spirit, I'm standing in the middle of the earth's core.
And tried to remove many more from the prime minister's home in Jerusalem early Sunday morning. On Saturday, thousands of protesters called for him to resign while he awaits trial for corruption charges. They're also unhappy with his handling of the pandemic. Israeli media estimates about 15,000 people protested outside of Netanyahu's home, holding signs reading, quote, "Crime Minister." I want to bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tayeb, who joins me now from London. Welcome, Imtiaz. So Netanyahu is blaming the media for these protests. Why is that?
Well, I mean, it's a pretty well-worn playbook, not just by Prime Minister Netanyahu, but really by a lot of world leaders, especially those who are facing widespread protests and anger, much in the way that Mr. Netanyahu is. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is really taking those criticisms and those attacks against the media in a country which describes itself as the world's or the Middle East's only democracy to a really new level, just sort of accusing the media, the Israeli media, of conspiring against him, of the coordinated campaign against him and against his family, which is driving people out into the streets. In fact, just on Sunday, he met with his cabinet, where in a 6-minute rant, for lack of a better word, he railed against the media and went on to describe the Israeli media, likening it to that of Soviet-era media or even North Korean media, saying that the criticisms that are being lobbed against him are false, are wrong, and again, just spewing this anger and hatred towards the media. Now, all of this, of course, comes at a time when he's facing a huge amount of criticism for a number of reasons. But really, this attempt by him, if you will, to sort of deflect that kind of criticism by going after the media, well, it doesn't seem to be working. If anything, these protests only seem to be growing. These are protests not only in Tel Aviv, where you might expect to see anti-Netanyahu protests, but you're seeing them in places like Jerusalem. You're seeing them in the north of the country. You're seeing them in the south of the nation. And all of that is bad news for Mr. Netanyahu, who really has been the longest-serving prime minister that Israel has ever seen. But rarely has he seen this kind of anger against him on the streets.
And Imtiaz, these protests over the weekend may have been some of the largest to date, but they're certainly not the first. Can you remind us when these protests began in earnest and what sparked them?
Yeah, these are certainly not the first protests, but they are getting very, very big. And, I've been covering Israel for a very long time. I've lived there for a number of years, have really only reported on the country with Mr. Netanyahu as prime minister. Like I said, he's been Israel's longest serving prime minister. But these protests feel different. Back in 2011, we saw huge protests, specifically in places like Tel Aviv, where over 1 million people went out to the streets to protest against the cost of living. But that was 2011. What we've seen since then is a number of things, most notably corruption cases against Mr. Netanyahu. In fact, he's the first Israeli prime minister in Israel's history to ever have an active corruption case against him in an Israeli court. In fact, he has 3 against him. But it gets even worse for him because as well as these very long simmering allegations of corruption and now these court cases as well, we also have to think about this moment that we're in. We're in a global pandemic, a once-in-a-century pandemic, and Mr. Netanyahu has really been criticized for his handling of it. Israel, which sort of prides itself as being a very technologically advanced nation, it calls itself the startup nation. It's also a country with a very robust universal healthcare system, which has seen sort of extraordinary advances over the years, and yet Israel is really struggling with the coronavirus. In fact, it's seeing infections spiking in many, many places around the country. And all of that, as we've seen elsewhere in the world, leads to an economic impact. In Israel's case, we're seeing unemployment of 20%. All of that has crystallized this anger against this prime minister, sparking to these protests, which has now been going on for many weeks now, and many believe could see the end of his leadership.
All right. Well, MTS Tayyab, thank you so much for all that reporting on Israel. We really appreciate it. Reimposing